Okay, so in the last module, we basically laid out the first 5 chapters of Darwin's Origin of Species. That basically says that if you look around you, there's variation, that there seems to be some basic genetic reason for this. He didn't use the word genetic, but we'll use our modern terms. There's a unit of inheritance that gets passed down from parents to offspring. That the world is a pretty really ruthless place. A poet around this time basically said nature's red in tooth and claw. It's a pretty fierce world, and that competition has to happen, and there's a struggle for existence. And then that if we look at organisms, some variants, um, because of the variation they have, are able to survive a little bit better and a little bit longer and have more offspring than variants that don't have those variations, and that there's differential survival. Okay, now the word he used for this was selection. Okay, some individuals are selected in this competition over other organisms. What's selecting? Nature is selecting, hence natural selection. So if you want, you can call the S selection if you want to combine these two together, that there's selection of some variants over others in the struggle for existence. That's totally fine by me. Then he puts these together and basically makes a bold conclusion. If you have a circumstance in nature where all this is happening, then what we see is that those populations of individuals that are better able to survive on average will have more babies or more gene copies, which means that the future generations will be filled more with the genes of their successful ancestors. The term he used for this was they become adapted. The organisms don't adapt, the population, the species adapts. You start off with a lot of variation, and at the end of selection, the variations that weren't able to survive don't have babies, those genes disappear, and the variations that become successful are the descendants of the ones that survived in the past. This is a really complicated idea, but it's also quite simple. And so we can round out this equation and put A at the end. The outcome of natural selection is adaptation. A population over time, on average, it's not guaranteed. There could be some luck involved, but on average, they are more likely to survive and reproduce because of their genetically inherited traits that give them different variations over others in their population. And so over time, the species evolves. How? By becoming better suited to their environment or by becoming adapted. So I like to use this little shorthand VISA as a shorthand for the logic of natural selection. Variation plus inheritance plus selection in a struggle for existence makes a population adapt or become naturally selected to be better suited to their environment. Visa. If you want, you can think of this in a modern scientific sense. Remember in science, when you lay out a hypothesis, we need to test it. And so if you want to see whether a population has evolved by natural selection, these are the fundamental tests that you do. And Darwin basically anticipated this. He laid this out in such a way. And here are two options. You can see this is very modern scientist's view. There are two options. Yes, the population you're studying must evolve by natural selection. There's no alternative. It must adapt. It must evolve by natural selection. The genes for the fit variants will become more common because their ancestors will have more offspring, which means there will be more copies of the genes in the population, and therefore the population not only it not only evolves, but it must adapt. Natural selection explains it. That's one outcome. Darwin's hypothesis seems to be true in that case. Although in this particular case, because of the logic he lays out, it must be true. This is one of those few instances in science that if you do these 4 tests and nothing else but all 4 tests and they all point in the same direction, this is a case you know the hypothesis is 100% correct. It's one of the weird circumstances. The other alternative is the hypothesis is false. Not it could be false, not it might be false. It is 100% absolutely, don't study it anymore, you falsified. In this population of organisms, Darwin cannot explain how it evolved. If you see it evolve, it's not natural selection that explains it. What it causes the explanation? Well, then we'll go into the non-Darwinian potential hypotheses next. So these are the two options. Natural selection is false in this case, or it is absolutely true. The hypothesis is confirmed or it's false. And how do we confirm it? Well, we do these four tests. Is there variation in the population? If there's no variation, every organism is exactly the same, genetically identical, they're clones of one another, natural selection doesn't work in this situation. It cannot work in this situation. There has to be genetic variation. But if there is variation, we have to go to the next test. Does it have a genetic basis? If there's variation, but it's not caused by genes, it's caused by diet, it's caused by other environmental factors, natural selection isn't involved. Natural selection requires genes to be involved. Okay, so both of these are dealing with, is there variation, is it genetic? By the way, the study of genetics, the field of genetics in a nutshell, started to understand the rules of variation and the rules of inheritance. So Darwin, in a way, started the foundation for the field of genetics. Then we have to answer these other two questions. Is there competition? Is there a struggle for existence? Is death more common than survival? If everything survives, you can't have winners and losers. You can't select for differences if they're all equally good. Some have to be better than others in the struggle for existence. Okay? If they all die, natural selection can't work. If they all survive, natural selection can't work. Some have to survive, others have to perish. That's kind of a gruesome thinking. Okay? But if there is competition, it could be natural selection. Then we have to do the other one. Are the ones that survive because of some variation that's heritable? If the answer is yes, then it has to be natural selection. But if the reason they're surviving is because of luck, or not because of their genes, or not because of variations, it's not natural selection. Only if every one of these tests, all four tests, are true, is natural selection going to be the case? If any one is false, it cannot explain it. And so what Darwin does in this brilliant book, you can see in some ways he's the first modern scientist, at least as a biologist. He lays out the hypothesis in the first 5 chapters, basically laying it out with a series of facts and says, when you put all these facts together, here's a hypothesis, natural selection. Then what he does with the rest of the book, and it's brilliant, is he tests it. He says, if this hypothesis is true, if this is how evolution typically occurs, then let's go through and test it using different ways to test it. So he looks at a chapter here on, it's called Difficulties of the Theory. It's basically laying out tests. And he looks at the fossil record. He looks at our knowledge of hybrids. He looks at geological knowledge. He looks at fossils. He looks at geographical distribution, what today we call biogeography. He looks at anatomy. He looks at physiology. He looks at embryology. He looks at development. And from all these different things that today we consider different branches of biology, he basically tests the hypothesis and says, does this hypothesis help us understand all these other facts that we know about in biology? And then the last chapter, the conclusion, he basically summarizes the book and says, in light of all these different facts of biology, my hypothesis, I think, still works. And therefore, after testing it, basically makes the argument that it is the leading hypothesis, and today we call it a theory. It's a brilliant marshaling of evidence and logic and really using modern science. And it's a big book. It's 500 pages long, but actually pretty easy to read, worthwhile. Okay, and if you want to look at it again this way, Visa, V-I-S-A. Another way to look at it is these 2 points are really the modern field of genetics, and these two here are actually the modern field of ecology. Competition, why do some survive, why do some reproduce easier and faster than others, and what allows them to survive and reproduce. So the whole idea of climate change and environmental issues and pesticides and why organisms aren't thriving, that's the field of ecology. So the field of ecology, the field of genetics, basically that's natural selection. I guarantee every course you will ever take in a biology department, whether it's at med school, dental school, pharmacy school, if it's talking about biology, it's talking about natural selection. Darwin puts all of these fields in a single perspective. There's a famous quote that says, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of natural selection. It puts all of it together and now makes sense of all of it. Okay, now there's a lot of jargon and terms that go along with natural selection, and if you see these words, we're talking natural selection. Kind of like if you hear the word species, think reproduction. Okay, so basically the word adapt and adapting and adaptive and adaptation, all of these words basically mean we're talking about natural selection. This word can be used in two different ways. Adaptation as a verb. A um, Basically a population is adapting. What that means is focused on that the population in front of us is in front of us doing visa. It's currently evolving. It's currently adapting. So if you see the word adaptation used as a verb, we're basically saying that based on our knowledge, this population is currently evolving by natural selection. If we talk about a morphological trait like hair and use a sense that it's an adaptation, here it's a noun, it's a trait. In this case here, what we mean is that this is something that organisms still have because at some point in their past, their ancestors evolved that trait as a way for them to survive better. Okay, so used as a verb, it means basically the population is evolving now. And as a trait, it means at the time this trait first evolved, it evolved by natural selection. It's something that if you get rid of that trait, they will, all things equal, have less fitness. They will survive less. They will have less offspring. Okay, and so most of the things we consider synapomorphies, if it's morphological, typically the reason they're so common, generally we interpret them as they were adaptive. So what is the function of hair? Well, it could be to keep you warm. It could be some other functions. And that function could change over time as it modifies. The function of hands is different than the function of a fin, for example. Okay, but in general, when we say that they're adaptive, what we mean is that the study of these traits in their evolutionary context shows that they increase the fitness of the organisms that have those. It was one of many variations, and because it was able to increase survivorship or fitness, the genes for those traits got passed on such that now they're very, very common. Now let's talk about the word fitness because that's also in here. Fitness, if you're a biologist, really means one thing, and you can think of it as the biological species concept. The biological species concept comes down to can you reproduce with others in your population because you have similar genes, you're genetically similar. Fitness is the same thing. How many gene combinations did you pass down to the next generation? How many babies did you have? How many offspring did you have? So this word fitness, if you're not a biologist, could mean I can bench press 50 pounds, or I can do 50 push-ups, or I can run a 4-minute mile. That's not what fitness means to a evolutionary biologist. Fitness simply means how many babies do you have in your lifetime. It could be one baby a year, could be 100 babies, and then you die. Okay. Either way, when it comes to evolution, it's baby making that matters. Again, that's the definition of a biological species concept in a way. So fitness, number of babies. In a way, this is how we measure evolutionary success. Organisms that have lots of babies are more evolutionarily successful because they will have more offspring, which means there are more copies of their genes, which mean that they will contribute more genes to the future. That quote I read earlier in a previous module from the book called The Selfish Gene basically looks at evolution from the concept of each gene and basically personifies that each gene is trying to make as many gene copies as possible in its lifetime, and it's using organisms basically to carry out that copy making. Okay, it's a selfish gene. It wants to survive and compete among other genes in order to have more gene copies. As the organism, we call them babies. If you're an ecologist, we use this word fecundity, number of babies you make. If you take ecology, it's really an evolution course. But it's sometimes difficult to measure babies. So it's hard to go up to a tiger and be like, how many babies have you had in your lifetime? It's hard to get that unless you're in a zoo. So another way, if we can't measure baby making, is how long did you live, under the assumption that things that live longer, on average, all things equal, have more babies. There we use the word mortality. That's a lesser but possible way to measure fitness if we can't measure this. It's kind of like morphological and biological species concepts.